My name is Matthew, and I'm a firm believer in the paranormal, and I have been even before I saw what I saw. This all happened in Wisconsin, near Point Beach, several years ago. I was in a car full of people when it happened, and I was not the only person that saw it. The sighting only happened for maybe 5 seconds at the most, but those 5 seconds are probably the most important 5 seconds of my entire life, because it solidified the fact that everything I believed in was real. It also proved my beliefs to my friends and girlfriend, because they were in the car. They always thought that I was the weird one for having beliefs that these kind of creatures exist. After that night, they all became believers too. So much so that one of my friends, Ryan, turned into a paranormal investigator. So let me set the story for you. My girlfriend, Krista, was driving that night. I was riding shotgun. In the back seat were our 3 friends, Ryan, Henry, and Jenny. Ryan and Henry are brothers. Jenny was Ryan's girlfriend at the time. Now they're married, and she puts up with all his investigations. He's not one of those people that go out and charge other people to investigate. He's more of a do-it-on-his-own-for-fun type of guy. Anyways, it was late, after 1 o'clock in the morning. We were driving back from another friend's place. We'd been on the road for about 45 minutes at the time, and still had a solid 30 minutes to go before we got back to Ryan and Jenny's apartment. We had plans to all crash there for the night. We were all wide awake. None of us were intoxicated. Ryan, Henry, and myself had a few beers that night, but that was hours before this happened. All of us were just chatting, when all of a sudden, Jenny and Krista both started screaming, and Henry started yelling for Krista to watch out. I looked back out the front window, since at the time I was turned around talking to my friends in the back seat, and I see this huge thing run straight across the road. This thing was only about 20 feet or so in front of us as it runs by, and all of us got a very good look at it. For me, there was no denying that it was a Dogman. I would testify in court. Krista had slammed on the brakes to avoid hitting it, but as she did, Henry started yelling out to her, "Don't slow down! Did you see that thing? Keep going!" That was enough to convince her, I guess, because she sped up and flew the hell out of there, even as everyone was still yelling and screaming about what the hell that thing was. I was the only one that had a clue as to what it was at the time, though. I knew it was the Beast of Bray Road, or at least another one of the same species. We weren't that far from Elk Horn, and who knows how far these things travel. The way this thing moved was faster than anything I've ever seen. It was unearthly. You watch these nature documentaries where cheetahs go after their prey. This thing was faster than that. This thing shouldn't have been able to move as fast as it did for how big it was. I'd like to estimate that it was 8 feet tall. Everyone in the car that night has their own opinions on how big it was, ranging from 7 feet to 9 feet. I think it was somewhere in the middle. Ryan is 6'2", and this thing looked like it towered over him. Where we were is 4 lanes, 2 oncoming, 2 going the direction we were traveling. This Dogman took 4 or 5 steps and it was across the entire road. Its stride was huge, and adding the speed that it moved, that encounter was only seconds long. Krista and Henry had both saw it at first, when it came out of the shadows on our side of the road. Krista thought it was a bear at first, but when she saw it in the lights is when she started to freak out. The whole time after we saw it, she was hysterical and kept saying it was a werewolf over and over and over again. I didn't really want to say anything different, since the thought of something that looked like a werewolf but wasn't any more comforting in my opinion. So I just kept my mouth shut and went along with the hysteria. He or she was black and shaggy, very well built, like a wrestler on steroids, like if The Rock was 8 feet tall, just solid muscle. Needless to say, this happened while it was on 2 legs. The front legs looked like they were bent upwards at the elbow and then hung down from the wrist, sort of like a kangaroo, I guess. It didn't look at us, it just stared ahead the whole time, so we only ever saw the side of its face, but it was definitely canine. The muzzle and the ear that we saw were a perfect match for a canine-like creature. But then later, Krista told me that when she first saw it and realized that it wasn't a bear, it was because it did look in our direction, and she felt that it was looking right at her. When it did that, its eyes reflected the light and gave off this green glowing color. She also saw large teeth in its mouth. Very long canines, but the rest of the teeth that she saw were sharp as well. Or at least, they looked sharp in the couple seconds that she saw it before us. She said she started screaming because she was hit with this feeling of just absolute terror. So much so that she didn't even mean to scream. It just started coming out. And then Henry said, when he first saw it, it looked like it was crouching down in the shadows, and when we got closer, it sprang up and started running out into the street. He thinks it was actually waiting for someone to drive by so it could run out in front of their car. Like it was trying to cause a car crash or something. Maybe that's a hunting tactic that it uses? Who knows? He said all he saw was this huge black mass at first, but he could tell that it was alive because of the way that it was moving. Like it was swaying back and forth, like it was trying to get a good view of the car. If that's the case, if they really are trying to cause a wreck, then the thought of that is terrifying. That means they see us as prey. This thing looked completely capable of taking down whatever kind of deer, moose, elk, whatever that it wanted. It could have torn our car apart and ripped all of us to shreds. If Krista had stopped like she intended to, or lost control of the car, I don't know what could have happened to us that night. I want to tell you something that I saw 3 years ago, but still have a hard time putting into words. When I saw it, I didn't even realize what I had seen until after the fact. It was like I was in a trance or something. My sister was with me at the time too, riding in the passenger seat, and she had the same type of experience that I did, where she didn't even realize what was going on. Neither of us spoke while it was happening. We both just watched this creature on the side of the road. It's hard to explain unless you've been in a situation where your brain just doesn't register what's going on until it's too late. A little bit about both of us. My name is Lori, and I'm 23 years old, but I was only 20 when this happened. My sister's name is Brittany. She was only 17 when this happened to us. It was late May on a Saturday evening, and we were coming back from visiting our grandparents for the day. We live in Michigan, and you know how the stories of the Dogman are popular here. But I'd never even heard of that thing until after we saw it and started looking into what it might be. When it happened, we were driving down this wooded area between our home and our grandparents. I'm sorry to omit the exact spot, but I just didn't feel comfortable with it. There was this area that had a lot of downed trees at the time, and some company was working on getting rid of it. Right after that spot, we both saw this creature walking along the road. At first, I guess I just thought it was a person as we passed by, but then this thing turned to look at us, and then it stopped in its tracks. It pivoted to face us, so we were able to get a really good look at it. But, like I said before, during the actual sighting, it was like my eyes were taking in this unbelievable thing, but my brain was either trying to keep me from realizing what it was, or I was so shocked that I couldn't come to terms with what I was seeing. Either way, though, as I passed by it, I just had this calm feeling, and I just stared, like I was mesmerized. I remember driving by it, and not even looking away. Some part of me knew that I was looking at something that shouldn't be there. I even remember Britt staring the same way as I was, and we even looked back as we drove by it, but neither of us said one damn word. As we passed by it, I remember looking back at it, and it just stood there for several seconds before going on its own way. As we drove away, this clarity started coming over me, like I was snapping out of a daydream or something, and I looked over at Brittany, who was staring at me, eyes as big as I've ever seen them. That's when I started to panic, because my brain started going into overdrive, and I asked her, "Did you just see what I saw?" All Britt could do was nod at me, and I could see the tears forming in her eyes. When she was finally able to talk, it came out as more of this breathless whisper, and all she said was, "I think we just saw a werewolf." And I could see my poor sister visibly shaking. I kept looking in the rear view, trying to see if it was still in view, but it wasn't. And then, as we drove around a corner, I sped up to get out of there as fast as we could. There was this unnerving feeling that was hitting me all of a sudden, and I was actually pretty terrified then. We seemed to babble about it for the longest time, the rest of the way home actually, and we both came to the realization that we were in some kind of trance when we saw it. There's just no other way to describe that feeling. I've read a lot about this creature now. After the encounter, I just needed to figure out what we saw so we could both have some kind of closure. And both of us researched it as much as we could. When we came across the Michigan Dogman, we knew that was what we had seen. The Dogman. What amazes me is how much the two of us remember in the 15 to 20 seconds that we actually saw this thing, despite not even comprehending it at first. Some details I remember, other ones are from my sister's description, but there are things that both of us remember, like how big this creature was, and how it had this look of just intelligence, or maybe even self-aware. This thing just seemed very smart. It was a chocolate brown in color. The hair didn't appear too long, maybe the length of a husky's coat, but not super shaggy. It walked like it had no problem moving around on just two legs. It wasn't flat-footed like a person. It looked like it was walking on its toes like a dog does. The legs were very long, and so was the torso. Like the torso was extended or something. And I actually have a theory that the torso was so long to compensate for how these creatures can move back and forth between 2 and 4 legs. Like its insides need to shift or something to avoid trauma from moving back and forth like that. The hair around its head and neck looked a bit longer than the rest of the body, and I'd be okay with calling that part of it shaggy. It almost looked like a mane if you ask me. It had pointed ears that were on the top of its head and a long muzzle like a wolf. The arms seemed incredibly long too, and very muscular. Britt remembers them going past the knees, they were so long. She also swears that the front paws seem to be more like hands, and remembers fingers, but I don't know if that's her imagination or if she actually saw that part. I did not see the hands myself, but the other thing that we can agree on was there was no tail on this thing. We've driven by that road many times since then, as recently as last weekend actually, since my grandparents still live there, but we try to only go during the day now. Seeing that thing at night would be too much for me. We haven't seen it since, but we always keep our eyes open for it. When we told our parents, they didn't seem very sure what to believe at first, but they've since done their own research too, and as far as their opinion goes, they believe that something is out there. They won't say what, but they don't think that all of these sightings, including their own daughters, can all be a case of mistaken identity. But I'll tell you this, you will be the first person I contact when and if I see it again. It was 3 weeks after I turned 15 that this happened to us. I saw a dogman, along with my dad, on our property in the middle of the night in late June. At the time, we were living in West Texas, just for reference, but I won't pinpoint the exact spot since my family still has the property there, even though it's owned and ran by my nephew now. I'm pretty sure he wouldn't want anybody going out there investigating. Also for reference, this happened 21 years ago, almost to the day. It took this long for me to feel comfortable sharing my story, just because that night was so frightening for me. So please, bear with me. This isn't really something I like to talk about much. Just writing all of this down for you makes me feel like I'm back at that night. And that fear that I felt as a kid, I'm pretty much reliving it right now. As far as my story goes, it was late, After 1 o'clock in the morning, I would say. And my dad woke me up because something was messing with our pigs. We lived on a ranch of sorts, and always had all kinds of animals running around there. Horses, sheep, lots of dogs and cats, chickens, and the pigs. I don't know if you've ever heard a pig squeal when it's scared, but when they're scared, they can make noise that would wake the dead. When my dad woke me up, I could already hear them going about it. Something had definitely spooked them. It sounded like they were getting murdered. He handed me a shotgun and said we needed to take care of whatever it was that was out there. I was thinking it might be a mountain lion, since we've never really had a problem with any other kind of wildlife there, and I was sure there wasn't a person out there trying to mess with our pigs in the middle of the night, just because nobody else really lived by us. I just wanted to scare it away if it was a mountain lion. I didn't want to hurt it at all. I think they're beautiful animals, to be honest. I've never really seen one out there, though. But I didn't really much like the pigs anyways, although I knew they were important to the ranch and the money that we made off of them. When we got out there, one of the pigs scared the crap out of me because it was running right towards us. It had gotten out of its pen. When we put the flashlights on the pen, we saw the fence was broken. Some of the dogs on the other side of the house were going nuts, and some of the pigs were still in the pen, and they were going crazy. But what made me shit myself was the big, hairy mass that was right outside of the pen, standing there looking at us. And it had one of the pigs slung over one of its shoulders. Now, let me tell you this, whoever is listening, if you haven't seen a creature like this yourself, I don't think you can exactly appreciate just what it does to you, how it makes you feel when you're looking at it. When you think back on it, it still scares you. This creature, or monster, whatever it was and still is, the most menacing thing I have ever seen in my life. It literally made my blood run cold, and this involuntary cry came out of my mouth, even though I had no control over it. We're talking 8 feet tall, solid muscle, covered in this thick hair that looked like it could help protect it from the elements, or fighting another animal or something. But the fact that it was standing on 2 legs was the worst part for me. What kind of animal can do that with a 400+ pound pig on its shoulder, holding it like it was nothing at all? The fur was this mix of gray colors, dark, medium, and light grays. It had a long muzzle, and you could see the teeth sticking out of the sides. Long canines that looked like they were made for killing, for putting its fangs into a neck and ripping it open. One arm was hanging at its side and reached past the knee, but the other was wrapped around that dead pig, like it was hauling something around. There was blood on this beast's muzzle, and a little bit on the chest too. I knew it was from that pig, because you could see this big, gaping wound on the back of its neck. Like this creature just swooped in there, grabbed one of the pigs, and bit right through its spine. I think that might be how it kills its prey. One quick, fatal blow. The flashlight that we had made the eyes reflect the light like a cat's does, but I don't think they were exactly giving off their own shine. I'm pretty sure it was just from the flashlights reflecting. I don't remember much about the feet, or whether or not it had a tail, and I don't really remember the ears except for being long. I'm sorry I couldn't relay that information for you on that part, but I think the rest of my description should suffice. I was too busy looking at this thing's face, not worrying about its feet. But I do know that it was insanely tall. We stood there, me and my dad, shocked to our core and unable to move, but my dad whispered to me not to run. If we did, who knows what the hell would have happened. I doubt we would have made it back to the house, and I wouldn't be here telling you that story. That thing didn't move either. It just kept staring at us, breathing in and out. And then it moved its mouth into this smile of sorts.
I mean, it actually smiled at us. And again I ask, what kind of creature is capable of doing something like that? But this wasn't a happy smile, not the kind you give friends or even strangers passing by. This was an evil, hateful smile, and it was very evident to me that this creature knew that it was on the absolute top of the food chain, and we were nothing compared to it. And you know what? I think he liked that feeling. It felt like it was daring us to do something to it. And I swear, it felt like an eternity that we were facing off. And then my dad said very calmly to me, "When I tell you to, raise the gun and fire." I knew he intended to do the same. But right there was probably when I was the most scared at any point in that entire night. What if we raised our guns, but it was too fast? What if it got to us before we could pull the trigger? I pushed the thought out of my mind and just readied myself for when my dad gave the order. And when he yelled, "Now!" we aimed and fired the shotguns. The sound of both of them going off was enough to wake the entire county, it felt like. I could feel my ears ringing. When we shot, that thing leapt backwards and to the side. I think my dad hit it a little bit though, because the noise this thing made was just unearthly. It was like it screamed, roared, yelled, and growled all at once. There is nothing I have ever heard on this earth that I can compare it to. But still though, that damn thing didn't slow down, or even act like it was hurt. It didn't even drop the damn pig. All it did was snarl and back up towards the darkness of the night, moving slowly and keeping its eyes on us. It did not look away one single time, not from the moment that we saw it to the moment that it started walking away from us. It never broke its gaze. If the look could have possibly been more sinister, I'd be surprised. This thing was just a malignant, evil force to be reckoned with. I knew that it was pissed off. I could tell by the look that it was giving us. I was scared to death that it was going to drop the pig and just come after us. I knew we were too far away from the house to make it. And if that shotgun blast didn't do anything to it, who's to say another one would? Or if we could even hit it. But then, this thing finally turned around and ran off. Still on two legs, I might add. Still with that heavy pig on its shoulder. The power and grace of this thing is unmatched to anything on this earth. I can tell you that. And what else I could tell you is that the size of the steps that this thing was taking was more than any man is possibly capable of. This thing moved so quick and so fluid. It was unnatural. It was supernatural. Finally, when that thing took off, me and my dad did too. And we hauled ass back to the house, huffing and puffing, yelling at each other to get up to the gate, to get up into the door, and to lock it, to get away from that creature. When we got back inside, my mom and my sister were up, asking frantically what the hell was going on because they heard the gunshots, trying to figure out if we were okay, trying to figure out what was going on with the pigs. For a couple of minutes, it was chaos. Everyone was trying to talk at once. Me and my dad were trying to explain what was going on. My mom and sister wouldn't stop talking, and my nephew was up crying. My dad told my sister to take him and stay away from the windows, and told me to help make sure everything was locked. Then he gave my mom a handgun, and told her quickly what was going on. Told her that we didn't have time to argue, that she just needed to believe us. She nodded, took the handgun, and went around looking at the windows and doors with us. My sister and nephew stayed in the middle of the house, where the extra living room was. You see, I was born late, as a side note. Quite a surprise for my parents, actually. My sister was 10 years older than me, and my brother was 13 years older than me. My sister's husband, my brother-in-law, drove trucks for a living, and whenever he was out of town, my sister and nephew would stay with us, just so they wouldn't have to be alone. My nephew was barely a year old at the time, so I felt like it was my duty to make sure the little one was looked after while my brother-in-law was away. I loved that kid. Even as terrified as I was, I obeyed my dad and went around making sure that thing wasn't coming back and that there was no way that it could get into the house, even though, looking at how that thing moved and how big it was, I was sure that it could just knock down one of the doors. Hell, even one of the walls, if it wanted to get inside. All of us spent the rest of the night together in the master bedroom, which was upstairs, watching out the windows. We could get a good view almost completely around the house. We brought all of the dogs in, and they were just antsy, like they sensed something that we couldn't see, like they smelled the scent of a predator. As for the pigs, a lot of them ran off, and we found most of them, but not all of them. I don't know if that thing got them or if they just ended up elsewhere, but there wasn't much we could do for them in the middle of the night with some kind of monster running around. None of us talked much that night. Joey, my nephew, slept through the whole thing after my sister calmed him down after the initial fright. How lucky for him, I kept thinking, just being so innocent and ignorant to what was going on. That beast never came back that night, though. And after that, my uncle came to stay with us for a little while, to help watch over the house at night. My dad had told him everything that happened, and luckily he believed him. So he packed a suitcase and came to stay. It just made me feel better, having him there. Another able body that could keep an eye out for us. My sister and Joey ended up staying at my uncle's place with his wife and daughter until my brother-in-law came back home. Nobody was comfortable with the thought of my little boy, my little nephew, my little buddy, being in that house when there was some kind of creature lurking around. All of us decided that it'd be better for my sister and him to just stay with my aunt, since my uncle wasn't there anyway. So we made the swap, and then my uncle stayed. My uncle, though, had this crazy idea in his head to follow the trail of blood that was left from that pig, but my dad forbade it. He wasn't going after that thing, and he wasn't letting his little brother go off to find it either. I was perfectly fine with that. I wasn't going anywhere near where it ran off. I wasn't even comfortable doing the chores around the house, on the outside, for a really long time. I was sure that one day I'd be outside feeding the dogs or bringing the horses in from the pasture, and that thing would be standing there, bounding after me, and that'd be the end of me. I tried to push those thoughts out of my head as best as I could, but when you see something like that, that's kind of the only thing you think about for a really long time. I had a hard time sleeping, a hard time concentrating in school. My grades even dropped because I was just so worried that that thing was going to come back. My dad even talked to neighbors around the area. The closest was about a quarter mile or so from our place. He didn't tell them exactly what he had seen, but he spun it enough to make sure that everyone was on alert after that because of some wild animal that was attacking the pigs and could possibly even attack one of the humans around there. A few people he talked to said they'd had missing animals too, mostly dogs or cats or a couple of young sheep, but nobody ever saw what got their animals. Believe me, they're lucky to have not seen what we did that night. As for that creature, as of now, so many years later, it never came back. But I know that it's still out there. I've heard enough of these stories now to know that these things are pretty much everywhere, and that a lot of people have seen them. Some encounters are more benign than mine, and some are even more terrifying. But I know the terror that I felt that night. I still feel it when I think about it. Like I said, just writing all of this down is really giving me the creeps, and I'm glad that I did it during the day. I'm pretty sure tonight I'm going to have a couple of beers to calm my nerves and maybe watch something funny on TV to clear my mind from this. Thank you for taking the time to tell this story. I know a lot of people say that, but I'm sure they all mean it. I'm very grateful that there's people like you out there that want to share these stories, so people like me don't actually have to. We can just write it down and send it off to you, and you'll do the rest. So that's my story of seeing a dogman, or werewolf, or whatever you want to call it, here in Texas. Thank you very much, and God bless. This happened last year in Ohio. We live pretty far out in the cuts, and there's a lot of forested area around us. I think that's why this creature was snooping around our place. It came from the forest. It was a typical Saturday night. My friends Carl and Nick were over, and we were playing Halo. Usually, my parents would go out for the evening to have a date night, and us guys would stay at our house and play video games. All three of us were 16. So we were old enough to stay by ourselves. Our dog was also hanging out with us. She's a husky collie mix named Caroline, like the Neil Diamond song. In fact, we usually call her Sweet Caroline. It was around 10:30 or so, and we were taking a break and eating some pizza, just laughing and having a good time. I was thirsty, so I got up to get a water, and Carl and Nick asked to get one for them too, so I said I would. When I got up, so did Caroline. She usually follows me everywhere I go. She was kind of whiny about it though, so I figured she had to go outside, which I'd let her out after I got the water, since the door to the backyard was on the opposite side of the house. As soon as I went through the swinging door of the kitchen though, I had this feeling like I shouldn't be there. I think it was my body telling me that I was in danger. I heard this low growling noise and looked at the window that was above the sink. I couldn't help but yell out in fright, because there was this thing in the window that looked just like a werewolf. The head and arm were in the window, and the screen was missing. Caroline started barking like crazy, and this thing let out this growl that was so intense that I flew back through the door yelling like an idiot to my friends that there was a werewolf trying to get into the window. Of course, they didn't believe me for a second, but I screamed at them, swearing words that I shouldn't say, and told them that I wasn't lying. This thing was dark brown, with a long muzzle and a black nose on the end. It had skinny ears that started on the sides of its head, and it had tufts of hair on the top. The tufts were the same color as the rest of it. It had yellow eyes like a cat, but they really seemed to glow on their own. And it had kind of shaggy hair on the top of its head. When we locked eyes, I felt like I was going to die. It looked very angry, and when it growled, it also lifted up its lips to reveal a row of really long, sharp teeth. The arm that was inside and through the window had shorter hair than the head, but the exact same color. It was really long, longer than I think an arm should be. The really messed up part, though, was that it actually had hands and fingers that looked almost human. It was in no way a paw that I was looking at. And I think this creature was trying to fit through the window, or at least grab something that it had smelled after it got to our home and ripped the screen off of the window. But anyways, Carl and Nick both get up and go into the kitchen. Caroline was still there, going nuts, but that thing wasn't at the window anymore. But it was only a couple seconds later that we believe it ran past the other window in the kitchen, and it was big enough to convince both of them that something was outside, even though whatever it was outside was moving too fast for any of us to get a good look at it. And also, it seemed to me like it was running on two legs because it was so tall. It actually looked taller than the window, which would make it at least 7 feet tall. Both of my friends freaked out, and I told them that I wasn't lying, and that it went in the direction of the backyard, so it probably ran around the corner of the house. Like idiots, we ran to the backyard to see if we could see it, even though there was part of my brain saying that it could be running to the door to the backyard, trying to get into the house. And even though I felt this dread again, I guess I was still curious or something. Maybe I'm just dumb. So we open the back door and look, and sure enough, there's that werewolf thing at the back of the backyard, standing by our gate. That's when all three of us got a really good look at this thing. It was so big, so huge, it looked like it would put any bodybuilder to shame. It was taller than our 7-foot fence. Its head and shoulders cleared the top of the fence, and it was standing on 2 legs. It looked like it was standing on its toes or something, kind of like Caroline does when she walks around, and it had those pointed things sticking out the back of the back legs. The whole body was dark brown, just like the head, and the fur on its chest area was a lot longer than the rest of its body, even the shaggy portion on the top of its head. It really looked to me like it was built of pure muscle. Every part of it was just enormous. The arms were muscular, the shoulders were muscular, the neck, the thighs, even the bottom of the legs. Just all muscle. It was the most intimidating thing that I'd ever seen in my entire life. It almost looked like that werewolf from Van Helsing when the guy turns into it in the building, but bigger and more intimidating. Same basic shape though. Carl and Nick started swearing and yelling, and I think they were both in shock. The werewolf, or I guess it could be a dogman or whatever it was, stared at us for just a second or two, and then snarled in our direction, just like it did when its head was inside my window. The look that this thing was giving us made me realize how intelligent it just might be. And I've seen enough werewolf movies to know that sometimes they can keep their human intelligence. I know it sounds dumb to compare real life to a movie, but I really think that sometimes these writers in Hollywood make movies out of their own experiences and just never tell anyone about them. I think that could actually be it. How some people get what I saw and all the details just right. At this point, I'm panicked. So are my friends. Caroline is more protective and aggressive than I've ever seen her. She was barking and snarling, and then she bolted past us and took off in the direction that thing was standing. Now I'm screaming at her to get back, because I know she's gonna die if they fight each other. That thing looked like it was made to rip things apart. And then something even crazier than seeing a werewolf in your own backyard happened. This thing actually used the door handle on the gate to open it. The door clicks shut when it's closed. You can tell that it's closed, and it swings into the backyard, not out into the trees and the fields behind us. This thing used the handle and the door like it knew what it was. That's when I realized that it really was that intelligent, and that maybe it was hunting us the entire time. It slipped out of the backyard and ran off into the woods behind our house, and Caroline kept running after the damn thing though. It darted out of the gate, and she darted with it. I knew I shouldn't have, and I do realize how dumb of an idea it was, even now. But I ran after her. She was my dog. I loved her. I wasn't about to let her get ripped apart by this creature if I could do anything to stop it. I ran after her, screaming for her to come back. Nick and Carl actually followed me, screaming at me to come back, because they didn't want me going off alone into the woods after a werewolf and my dog. They'd seen the creature too. Now that's a good friend if you ask me. These guys had no idea where that thing was or what it was capable of, but they saw what I did, and they could use their imaginations just as well as I could. They knew that thing could rip us apart easily, one after the other, and not even break a sweat. But still, my 2 best friends in the entire world ran off after me into the dark woods to help find my dog. But before we could even get out of the backyard, we hear this commotion on the other side of the fence. I have no idea what happened in the time it took us to get to that gate, but I know I have never heard anything scream like that in my entire life. It wasn't a scared scream. It was almost a battle scream or something, like that thing was in a fight. The noise actually made me stop running for a minute because I was so scared. It was just so bad. I heard Caroline going nuts. I heard her barking and yipping, and then I heard her yelping and more of those screams. and more barks, but what also sounded like a cross between a grunt and a roar, so I think Caroline got in a couple good licks too. When we made it to the back gate, I realized something else. It was pitch black out there. We had no lights, anything like that. Not even our phones to use the flashlight on our phone. I've never felt fear like that. I couldn't see anything. The woods were dead silent, and I knew there was a monster out there. The only thing I could actually hear was the beating of my own heart, and the breathing of Nick and Carl behind me. I also had no idea where my dog was. And then we heard movement, and my heart stopped beating. I thought that thing was coming for us, but luckily, it was just Caroline. She was limping really badly, and even in what little light there was, I could see her limp, and I could see that she was covered in something dark. That turned out to be her own blood. I picked her up, and I ran back to the house with Carl and Nick as fast as I could. And I want to point this out. I want to thank my adrenaline, because that dog is about 70 pounds, give or take. But I picked her up and ran back home like she weighed nothing at all. We slammed the door and locked it, and I started looking over Caroline. She had some really bad wounds on her side. They looked like claw marks to me, and she wouldn't put any pressure on her front left leg. But she was still wagging her tail and licking me, so I knew that it wasn't seriously life-threatening, but it probably hurt really bad. We ended up calling my mom and dad and telling them that Caroline got into a fight with something, and we needed their help. We took her to the vet, and she had to have surgery to repair the wounds on her. I guess they were so bad she had to get put under anesthesia or something like that. The vet asked what attacked her, since she'd never seen wounds like that before, but the three of us said we didn't know. Her leg turned out to be fine, and turned out to be what our vet called a soft tissue injury that would eventually go away on its own. We got to take her home the next day, and they told us how to take care of her while she was healing. She had to have some stitches in her gash, and she had to take a few different medicines for pain and to make sure it didn't get infected. She also had to wear one of those cones until she was healed. I think that's the part that she actually hated the most. That cone. The next day, my dad had to fix the screen on the window too. It looked like something ripped it right off of the kitchen wall, and it was so bent and torn, he actually had to buy a new one and fix the window frame before he could even attach the screen to the frame. He was convinced that it was a bear that was responsible for the window and for hurting Caroline. I still haven't told my parents what actually attacked her, or that that thing was trying to get into the house. But I have spent so many nights just lying awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling and getting nervous at any little sound, going around and looking out the windows, making sure that that thing wasn't there. Caroline, though, made a complete recovery and refused to leave my side like always, especially when we were outside, which didn't help my nerves at all. As far as I know, that thing hasn't come back in over a year. Hopefully it doesn't at all. I plan on telling my parents, though. I want to tell them the truth about what happened that night, especially since I'll be going to college in the not-too-distant future. They should probably know what's out there in the forest. I just hope they believe me. I think I might actually have Nick and Carl there when I tell them, or at least have them talk to them too and tell them their experience. I was thinking about maybe doing it separately, so they realize we all saw the same thing because of our descriptions of it. If we all have the same details of what we saw, they have to believe us, right? What I want to know, though, is why that thing was halfway in the window when I walked into the room. If I hadn't, would it have figured out a way to get in? I don't think that window was big enough for its entire body to fit through. Maybe it was just trying to get something there in the kitchen. There was some pizza on the counter and some fruit, but I don't think that thing likes to eat fruit or pizza. Maybe it was trying to get in. That way it could kill us all in the sneak attack. I can imagine my parents' faces now if they came home and saw all three of us and Caroline ripped apart all over the living room. Sometimes I think I hear howling at night off in the forest by our house, but I think it might just be my imagination. Still though, those are the nights that I make sure that all the doors and windows are locked. And those are the nights that Caroline actually gets a little antsy, which again, doesn't help my anxiety. I know my dad has a few rifles and handguns in the house, but honestly, I don't think anything that he owns would stop that creature. I know a lot of other people have seen this creature, and I am familiar with the Germantown werewolf. Hopefully, it's not the same thing. But on one hand, I kind of hope it is the same thing, because if there's other things out there that are similar, either a dogman or a werewolf, what's to say that everything else that we think is under our bed isn't really? I want to thank you for taking the time to read this, and I hope all of your subscribers enjoy my story. Even though it was a terrifying experience, it still makes for one hell of a campfire story. Have a good night, Supernaturalist, and all of you creatures of the night.
My name is Jake, and I have a story to tell you about the Dogman. I was actually raised on a story about Dogman too, and I'm going to get my parents to contact you with their story as well. I just didn't want to wait to send this to you after finding your channel. I live in Ohio, and I have always thought of myself as a very down-to-earth person. And honestly, I'm not even sure I believe my parents' story that they would tell me as a kid. The thought of something that walks around on two legs, looking like a werewolf straight out of Hollywood is pretty unbelievable. But trust me, there's something out there like that. This was not a normal wolf, and it was definitely not a bear. A couple things you should know about me, for context, is that I was raised to be an honest person. I can thank my parents for that. I've never been much of a partier. I've never ever experimented with drugs, and I've only had the occasional drink. I was 19 when this happened. My girlfriend, who was in the car, was the same age, and my little brother was 17. It was January when it happened. It wasn't snowing that particular night. We all saw the same thing. I know a lot of people email you, saying they saw something they can't explain. I guess now I'm one of those people. This happened to us, near Montgomery County. It wasn't too long of an encounter, but I know exactly what I saw that night. It was Dogman. I know this because of the story that my parents told me that happened before I was born. Like I said, I was raised on that story. Even if I didn't believe them as a teenager, I was scared of those stories as a child. As a boy that had recently graduated high school the June before this happened, and on my way to adulthood, I learned through this experience that my parents were not making it up. If I'd been alone when I saw that thing, I might have had the smallest notion that I imagined it, or that it was a hallucination or a dream. But I wasn't alone. My girlfriend Brienne was there. My brother Ryan was there. They both saw it too. It wasn't even too late at night. Not even 11 o'clock. It was a clear night, so the vision was perfect. None of us had any type of alcohol or drug in our system. We all saw the same thing. We all wrote down what we had experienced when we got back to the house. We all believed it was a Dogman we saw that night. And so this is what happened. The three of us were driving back from seeing a movie, Black Panther, and we were talking on one of the back roads as we drove back. We were headed to my house. Ryan had a curfew since he was still in high school, but he was with us, so it was kind of laxed. Still, we didn't want to take advantage of my parents' rules, so we were going straight home from the movie. I was going slightly over the speed limit, just because I wanted to get Ryan home. I was driving, Brienne was sitting next to me, and Ryan was in the back seat. All of us were wide awake, and discussing what we liked about the movie, and how we couldn't wait for the next Marvel film to come out. But then, Ryan pointed out of the front window and blurted out, "What in the hell is that?" Our lights bounced off of something, some kind of animal, and we rounded the corner. We got a good look at it. This thing was standing on the side of the road, just at the corner, still in the grassy area, but almost on the road itself. It was standing on two legs, just like a human. I slowed to barely a crawl, because I was intrigued as to what this creature could be. I shouldn't have done that. I should have just kept going. This thing looked over at us and actually lifted an arm that was ending in a clawed hand to shield its eyes from the light. Before it did that, though, the headlights seemed to reflect in the eyes, giving it that glow of a nocturnal animal. Now, I want to be specific with this because I know a lot of people say that they seem to be glowing themselves, but these eyes definitely just reflected the light of our headlights. And I knew instantly what we were looking at because of that damn story that my parents used to tell me. So did my brother, and he yelled out, "It's the Dogman." I stopped the car because I didn't want to go past it. I didn't turn it off, I left it running obviously, but I didn't want to go past this thing. Brienne was screaming at me to go. Ryan just kept yelling, "It's the Dogman," over and over, pointing and saying, "Look, look, it's the Dogman," like I could possibly be focused on anything but the creature that was in front of us. My parents always said that it was huge, but I guess I never appreciated just how big this thing actually was until I saw it for myself. It had to be 7.5 feet tall, at minimum. Brienne thinks the same thing, but Ryan says bigger, maybe even 8.5 feet tall. It was ripped, too. Like a bodybuilder that spent all day, every day, lifting weights, especially the shoulders. It looked capable of carrying off extremely heavy prey, or at least pinning it down and killing it quickly. The quads of this thing were extremely thick and muscular too, bigger than even a pro wrestler's quads. It was a really dark brown color, like the same coloration of the werewolf in Silver Bullet. In fact, it looked a lot like that werewolf, except way, way bigger. This was definitely not a guy in a suit. It had a long muzzle, like a dog or wolf, and big ears too. The hands on this thing were deadly. I could see the one that it was using to cover its eyes very clearly. It had long, wicked-looking claws that looked like a fingered hand. It wasn't a paw. It was a hand. And those claws looked capable of evisceration. I could see the flesh on the palms. It was also a very dark brown color, but definitely hairless. Also, it was definitely male. I could see the boy parts. But the penis didn't look human. It looked more canine. The Dogman put his hand down after the initial light hit his eyes, and it stared at us. He didn't seem angry or aggressive, but he also didn't seem the least bit scared. It was like it was waiting for us to make a move, so it could decide how to react to it. I remember the sounds of the windows going up distinctly from the passenger seat and the back seat. I rolled mine up too. I really didn't know what to do at that point. I wanted to get out of there, but I also wanted to see this thing, since I'd heard the story of my parents' encounter all my life. Ryan and Brienne were both telling me to go, but I was scared because there was no way I could gain enough speed before we passed that thing. I didn't want it attacking the car, or breaking a window and pulling one of us out. I felt responsible for all three of us. My girlfriend that I needed to protect, and my baby brother, who I had always looked out for. I knew I had to do something, though, because we were in the middle of the street, and I didn't want anyone to come up behind us and hit our car. So, I decided that maybe flashing my brights might scare it off. So I quickly turned them on and off several times. When I did this, the Dogman threw both hands up to its face to cover its eyes and started shaking its head wildly, like the lights were too bright for his eyes. And I knew then that my idea wasn't exactly the best. I think all I really managed to do was piss it off. It looked at us again, and it let out this roar, or scream, that was so loud we could hear it inside the car with the windows up. I knew I messed up. Brienne started screaming too, and my brother started yelling, "Get out of here! We need to get out of here! The Dogman's gonna get us!" Then, this thing put its hands down and actually charged straight at us. Ryan was screaming at this point to drive, He was hysterical. I slammed my foot on the gas, but like I thought, we didn't build up much speed. It looked like that Dogman was going to plow right into the front of the car. But as it ran by us, it moved to the right at the last second and we sped by it. I was too busy trying to get out of there, but Ryan gave a very good description to me of what happened next. When we passed by it, it spun around to look back at us and roared again. Ryan said the taillights were illuminating it, and the expression on its face was the angriest that he's ever seen. He could see it snarling and saw long teeth that looked just as deadly as the claws. Ryan said it dropped down to all fours and bounded after us for a few leaps, but it stopped almost as soon as it started, like it automatically gave up or it wasn't interested in us. Then it went back down, like it was doing a push-up motion. But as it came back up, it sprang back on two legs and took off onto the other side of the road. Then he lost sight of it in the darkness. I honestly think that that creature was giving us a bluff charge to get us the hell out of there. It's like we couldn't decide what to do, so he decided what we should do for us. Believe me, it worked. We got out of there. The whole way back to our house, all three of us were talking over each other, trying to discuss what we had just seen. I was still so nervous that I was shaking, and my hands were freezing. I really thought that I was going to throw up at that point, too. But what I can remember the most about that part is how cold my fingers were. I don't know why I remember that so vividly, but because it was so vivid, I just figured I'd throw that in there too. Maybe so you guys could feel how scared I was. Ryan was just yammering about seeing a werewolf and that our parents were telling the truth our whole lives. He was talking about what the odds could be that us seeing one was the same one that my parents saw. I have to admit, that thought crossed my mind too, especially when it was right there. I wasn't sure though, since they'd seen it hours away from where we saw it, and it was before I was even born, so that thing must have been really old. But I wasn't ruling out the possibility that it was the same creature. My girlfriend, my poor Brienne, looked like she was on the verge of tears, and she wouldn't let go of my hand. She was dumbfounded that my parents were telling the truth too. I mean, of course I had told her the story about 100 times, that they claimed that they saw some type of werewolf creature way back in the day, but I don't think that she believed them either. I guess she was just as skeptical as I was, but none of us were skeptics anymore after that. We all saw the same damn thing as my parents did. When we got home, we immediately told my parents that we saw the same type of creature that they saw. They shrugged and said it was a dogman, and then they sat us down and we all just talked about what we felt about it. Terrified mostly. That was the general feeling between the three of us. Terror. My parents were understanding. We described what it looked like, hoping that it might be the same one, but the color didn't match. I'll let them tell you all about what they saw when they contact you. My fear, though, is that Ohio has several of these things running around. Maybe even a breeding population. And the reason I think this is because this happened more than 20 years after my parents' encounter. This thing that we saw didn't look old. It didn't look the way that a dog or a wolf does when they're aging. But then I thought to myself, who knows how long these things live? And so I ask you, exactly how long are these lives capable of for these creatures? When I was a kid, we had this big lab mix that we had to put to sleep when he was 14 years old. And the vet told us that he was really old for a dog. I mean, unless these things live longer, which I'm not saying it's not a probability, I really don't think that it was the same one. Especially when you throw in the fact that the coat wasn't the same color either. It scares me to think of what's out there. How many of these things are running around Ohio? How many of these things are running around the United States? All I know is, I no longer think my parents were telling us a story of the Dogman just to keep us in line. They were telling us the truth. Okay, this happened to me last year in Ohio, and I still have so many questions about it. I still have a hard time coming to grips with it and accepting that monsters really are real, and that I saw one firsthand. So, bear with me here, please. I guess I should start by telling you about myself. My name is Wendy, and I'm 18 years old. I was 17 when this sighting happened, though. I'm a pretty shy person, not your stereotypical teenager. I like to be by myself and explore over going to parties and flirting with boys. I guess that was what started my troubles. I was out by myself when this happened. I'm also using my talk-to-text app, so if this sounds really informal, that's why. Anyways, like I said, this happened in Ohio. I'd rather not say the exact location, but if you really want to know, I think I can trust you to keep it a secret. But I guess to describe where I live, I actually have to tell you that I live on the eastern part of the state, and I live really close to the Appalachian Mountains. I was out in the woods when this happened to me. It changed my life because now I know what's really out there. It was a Saturday, around this time of the year actually, May 23rd. Because of all the COVID-19 stuff going on, I would just spend my weekends walking around the forested areas and exploring. There really wasn't much else I could do anyways, with the world shut down and all. I'd come across this big man-made box up in a tree on a hike a few times before this. I guess it was a deer blind. Basically, it looked like a big wooden box with one side missing and a window cut in the other 3 sides. It was accessible from a ladder that also looked very man-made. Basically, 2x4s nailed together to form this makeshift ladder. I thought it was neat, and I had climbed up there the first time I saw it. This time, though, I had a backpack with me, with some snacks, water, and the book I was reading at the time. It was 4 Past Midnight by Stephen King. I was reading the library policeman portion when this happened. That's not too important to know, but if I was listening to somebody tell me this story, I'd be curious. So I climbed up into the blind to read some of the book and just forget about how weird the world was lately. At this time, there were a lot of people that thought this was Armageddon or some shit like that. I just wanted to feel carefree for a while, but I guess it didn't really happen that way. I'd been up there for a while and actually read a lot, and I was really into it, so I have no idea just how long I was up there. But I remember hearing this weird sound. It was like a deep, deep growl, but it didn't exactly sound close. It sounded far off, which was weird to me because it sounded so loud. After that, I set my book down and listened for it again, and that's when I realized how freaking quiet it was around me. It was like I was actually inside the library. There were no animals making any kind of sound at all. And then I started hearing this crunch, crunch, crunch noise coming from the woods, and I started freaking out. My first thought was it was the guy that owned the blind, and I was in deep shit, or it was some other person, and I really didn't want to have a run-in with some stranger. I mean, I'm a teenage girl that's 5'2", can barely defend herself, and weighs about 110 pounds. Only, it wasn't some guy that walked out of the woods. And in retrospect, I think a guy walking out of the woods would have been the least of my concerns. This was something, not someone. I barely noticed it at first because it was moving so slowly, and it was really well hidden for as big as this thing turned out to be. When I first saw it, it was just peeking around the corner of this tree, and I was just peeking out around the window. So I don't think it saw me, but luckily I saw it. Now, I fully believe it not only knew that I was there, but it had smelled me or sensed me way before that. And I think that's why it was moving really cautiously at first. But when it came out into the open, I saw its whole body, and I actually had to cover my mouth to keep from screaming. For lack of a better term, even though I'm sure everyone listening knows exactly what a dogman is, what I was looking at looked like your classic effing werewolf. I mean, the head looked like a wolf, but a monster wolf, something from a scary movie. Its head was really big. The muzzle was super long, and the ears stuck straight up out into the air. I could even see the skin on the front of the ear, where there wasn't fur. It had a big, wet, black nose, and it kept sniffing the air with it. It was looking around every couple of seconds, and would open its big-ass mouth, and I could see all these terrible, horrible teeth. I could also hear it breathing. Of course it was standing on 2 legs, and those legs were like a gym addict kind of muscular. It stood like a dog, on its toes, and the fur on its legs was shaggy and kind of matted, like it was losing its coat or shedding or something. The waist and torso looked stretched out to me, like longer than a human's, but maybe not for this creature. The proportions just didn't make sense to me though. The whole coat was gray and brown and tan. It looked like the colors were made to blend into the woods, which I can tell you, it really did blend in. By now, I'm so scared, I feel like puking, crying, and screaming for my mommy. If you'd never felt fear like that, you're lucky. It was like unbearable how scary it really was. And it only got scarier because this thing walked right under the tree and right under the blind and started growling again. Then making this weird, almost whining noise. But the whine was also mixed in with the growl. And it was so loud, I could actually feel it, and I was shaking from it. Not just because I was scared, but because it felt like my insides were vibrating. Then the freaking blind started shaking, like this thing was trying to tear the whole tree down. At this point, I'm screaming. I'm not even stifling myself anymore. I knew that it knew I was there, and so I was not being quiet. I'm trying to be as loud as possible to scare this thing away. And then I hear these snapping noises and think the blind is starting to give. But it turns out later that this werewolf thing was ripping the steps off of the ladder. Now you have to realize, I think I'm dead at this point. I just knew that that thing was going to pull me down, destroy the blind, and eat me. It's growling and grunting. I'm screaming for help, not even trying to scare it away at this point now. Just screaming and hoping somebody hears me to come help me. The noises that this thing was making were out of this world. Crazy, primal noises, like it wanted me and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I actually peed. I was so scared. Then everything stopped and I held my breath. I guess I was just waiting for it to attack again. When it didn't attack, I peeked out of the window and saw it standing there, just staring up at me, like it was trying to figure out how to get to me. And I saw an intelligence in those eyes that I haven't even seen in the primates that I see at the zoo. I screamed again, also crying my eyes out. I was trapped. I had nowhere to go, and that thing was waiting for me to come down, or trying to figure out how to get to me. Either way, I thought I was toast. Then it started grunting again. It almost sounded like grunts that cavemen make in those movies. That's what I describe it as, at least. There were these spots on the floor of the blind that I could look through and saw it moving back and forth under there, just pacing and looking up. It had such a human quality that it was just surreal to me. I had the feeling that it was frustrated that it couldn't get to me. It let out a couple of barks and then got down on 4 legs and ran around the tree a couple of times, barking and yipping. I started screaming again, but then it stopped and looked up at me on the other side that didn't have the wall. And it actually cocked its head like a person would do, and huffed, like a frustrated, I give up huff. And then it ran off while it was still on 4 legs. I got the hell out of there too, in the other direction, which was not in the direction of my house. But I needed to get out of that tree, and I needed to get out of the forest, and I was out in the open, so I could get the hell out of there. When I went to go down is when I noticed the steps were ripped off. The ladder was a mess, and I ended up having to jump a few feet down. And let me tell you, it's a good thing that I like track and field, because I tore out of there as fast as I could, and I didn't stop to take a breather. Not until I was out of the forest and knew that I was safe. I left my backpack and my book and everything else there. I don't know how far up in the tree the blind actually was, but when I jumped, the steps were broken over my head, so this thing could reach up at least 6 or 7 feet, but I think it was even taller than that. It had to weigh a couple of 100 pounds too, maybe even more. I can't really describe the size of this thing, but it just looked massive. I made it home though, and I cried the whole way back and kept looking around to see if it was chasing me. but I made it home. I didn't tell anyone for a really long time, and had trouble sleeping for months after that. I would actually stay up most of the night and sleep during the day, which my schedule allowed me since it was distance learning and everybody knows that was a joke. And then it was summertime, so I didn't have school. I never will go back there. I have no intention of ever going into that area of the forest ever again, not even to show my friends where it happened. And I told every one of the people that I share my story with that if I find out they went looking for this thing, I'd be really, really upset, and maybe not even talk to them again. I don't want anything happening to anyone because of me. I know it wasn't a werewolf that I saw. I know it was a dogman. It was daytime. I mean, werewolves only come out at night, right? People I tell say that I'm crazy for believing in all of these things, but if this thing is out there, then other things have to be too. Anyways, thank you for listening, and hopefully this will make it on your channel. I think you do really good work sharing the truth and letting people tell their stories for others to believe too. The woods scare me now. I don't ever want to go back in them unless I have to. It sucks, but that's the reality. What are you gonna do, right? I still haven't even finished 4 Past Midnight. Just reading any part of it sends me right back to that day. I just can't do it. I know a lot of people out there, especially a lot of people that listen to these types of stories on YouTube, want to go out and find this thing. But I'd really suggest otherwise. And it's my advice to stay away from these things, because even though I got away, it doesn't mean other people will too. And in fact, a lot of the missing persons around the woods could be because of something like this. I hope you have a good day. Thanks again for sharing my story. Sincerely, Wendy.